Hello, this is the last lecture for chapter 23, and in this lecture we will do an overview of nutrition. We will talk about the macronutrients, the micronutrients, and we will also talk about cholesterol in the body. So when we look at macros, a lot of times we have our carbs, and we know that glycogen is the storage form of carbohydrate, and that it gets broken down into glucose, and that glucose gets stored as glycogen. The places we store glycogen are skeletal muscle and the liver. We know we have triglycerides. When we look at lipids, triglycerides are the main form of fat that we eat in our diet. They're the most abundant of the lipids, and they get broken down into fatty acids and glycerol. And then proteins are the most abundant organic component, and they get broken down into amino acids, and they perform vital functions: hormones, antibodies, structural proteins like keratin, collagen, etc. So let's look at the carbs. In your notes, you have a table, and I thought that might be the easiest way to organize what we're looking at. So what do you have to know about the carbs? Well, you need to know that the carbs have different types. We have our sugars, and when we look at sugars, we have monosaccharides, glucose, fructose, and galactose. Remember that the body, our cells, only burn glucose for energy, and so fructose and galactose will get converted into glucose by the liver. We have the disaccharides. Maltose is malt sugar, lactose is milk sugar, and sucrose is table sugar. And these need to get broken back down into the monosaccharides for absorption. We also have larger complex carbs called polysaccharides. These are things like starch, which is found in plants, and fiber, which is also in plants. We can't digest the actual fiber, but it's very important in helping us feel full and helping us have normal bowel movements. So there's soluble and insoluble fiber. Examples might be things like your vegetables, your peels, your oatmeal, brown rice. And then we also have the glycogen, as I mentioned. So anytime you eat any muscle, which is in meat, you get a little bit of glycogen. So you could just see some overview of what kinds of foods have the carbs. So why do we have carbs? Well, number one, energy. Glucose is used immediately for energy. The process of glycolysis can only burn glucose. Our red blood cells and neurons have to have a continuous supply of it. We can store it as glycogen. It does form cell membranes. We have glycoproteins that work like cellular ID cards. It does form DNA as well as RNA. And then the fiber that I just mentioned is really important for helping us have normal bowel movements. It actually lowers LDL, which is a type of bad cholesterol. It makes us feel full, and it really helps with insulin sensitivity and insulin resistance. Remember, one of the treatments or things you could do to help decrease insulin resistance is to make sure you take in enough fiber, and they're soluble and insoluble. So how much carbs should you eat? Well, that varies. Generally 50 to 60%. There's different diets out there that have recommended lower carbs or higher carbs, and we talk about good carbs and bad carbs. Basically, you do want to keep your sugar down, but not all carbs are bad. Fruits and vegetables are carbs. So if we have too many carbs, then we can store it as fat. It can cause obesity. It could raise our triglyceride level in our blood, and it could actually irritate the GI tract or cause insulin resistance, especially if you're eating those simple carbs and you're spiking your glucose, which causes the insulin surge. Over time, your cells become resistant. If you don't eat enough, like you're on a starvation diet, or you may be on a low carb diet, or you don't have the insulin, so you're not able to use the glucose, then we need to make glucose. So gluconeogenesis will happen. And often, remember, ketoacidosis can occur, because if you're burning those fatty acids at a high rate, and you're also having the glycerol coming in because we don't have as much carbs. We talked about the acetyl-CoA backing up, and we can produce these ketones. So there's different types of diets out there that mention, how much carb to eat. And, I don't think it's a one size fits all. You can try changing up your carbs. Some people do better when they eat fewer carbs. Some people, it doesn't really matter. You do want to watch out for that high fructose corn syrup because we do know it gets metabolized a little differently, and it's easier for the liver to convert it into fat for that fatty liver disease. And then some people avoid wheat. There is some evidence of wheat causing inflammation, a lot of times people eat more calories when they eat more wheat in their diet as well. So if you have any kind of like immune issues or inflammation, you might consider removing wheat from your diet and seeing if you feel better when you do that. The glycemic index is just a scale, and the number is basically ranking how quickly that food raises your blood glucose level. And the idea is that you would want to eat foods that are lower on the scale rather than higher, because the higher the number, the more likely it is to raise blood glucose levels and cause that insulin surge. So if you're diabetic or prone to insulin resistance, you probably want to stick to foods lower on the scale. Fats or lipids is another category of nutrient. Triglycerides are the main form of lipid that we eat. Triglycerides are found in all fatty foods. Think of animal products such as meats, dairy products, ice cream, coffee creamer, and they're a really good energy source. It's the most concentrated energy source of the lipids, and they are the main fuel for our hepatocytes or liver cells and skeletal muscle. These cells would actually prefer to burn fat for energy over glucose. Cholesterol is another lipid that we take in every day. Cholesterol is critical for forming cell membranes, so all the growth and repair processes, when we make new cells, we need cholesterol for all of those cells. It's a precursor for our bile salts, for the emulsification, and a precursor for steroid hormones, such as estrogen, testosterone, and cortisol. Fatty acids, these are fatty acids. They're long chains of carbon and hydrogen. They can be saturated or monounsaturated or polyunsaturated, and it's just referring to the number of bonds on the molecule. Saturated fats are solid at room temperature, and unsaturated are liquid. That's a quick way to tell. The fatty acids are critical for forming prostaglandins. These are hormone-like molecules. The letters PG and another letter like PGE, PGF. And so they work like hormones. Some of them can cause fever and pain. Leukotrienes are another example of fatty acids. These were some of our inflammatory fatty acids. We talked about thromboxanes when we looked at blood clotting, and something called prostacyclin. These are all fatty acids. Phospholipids are critical for forming those cell membranes as well. In this picture, you see the phospholipids with a little polar head and tails with the cholesterol. So critical, again, for every cell membrane. And it helps form that myelin, that white fatty material that was around axons. And then we have adipose tissue. These are adipocytes, and this is where fat is stored. And it's very important for cushioning. It helps insulate us, and it's a storage form of energy. So how many carbs are you supposed to take in your diet? Well, the current recommendation is less than 30%. So they usually say 20 to 30%. What you really want to watch is your saturated fat and your trans fat. So what we know is that saturated fat and trans fats are very bad for us. They increase our cholesterol levels. They have been shown to have an increase in cardiovascular disease. The saturated fats have been shown to increase the type of bad cholesterol we'll be looking at shortly, called LDL. And they've also found a correlation with high saturated fat and saturated fats effect on increasing insulin resistance. The trans fats are the really bad ones. And you can look at this picture, this graphic, and kind of get an idea of where these fats come from. So saturated come from animal products and dairy products. And as I mentioned, they're solid at room temperature, and they do increase cholesterol levels. There have been research on coconut oil. So coconut oil is saturated. I have seen studies saying that coconut oil is very healthy for us and does not cause a detrimental effect on our lipids. and risk for heart disease, and I've seen studies that say it does. So I think the jury's still out. You should research that yourself if you use a lot of coconut oil to cook in. The trans fats, they're bad. Everyone knows they're bad. So they're processed. These are hydrogenated fats that actually change the fat. And they know that when that does that, it really does have an effect on heart disease and even cancer. Then we have mono and poly. These are the better ones to eat, and you can see some of the sources here. The limits for cholesterol were changed, and there is no longer a dietary limit on cholesterol. They used to say 300 milligrams a day, which is the amount of cholesterol in one egg white, but that's been removed because we know that the liver actually makes most of our cholesterol anyway. So if you take in more fat than you need, then we're going to store it as fat. You will have a risk of obesity. You could have an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. Again, depending what type of fat you're eating, issues with insulin resistance and cholesterol levels. If we don't take enough fat in, if we have too little fat, then if we look at the functions, we will have issues with probably feeling cold all the time, cushioning around our body cells as well. And then it could affect our ability to make the prostaglandins, leukotrienes, and repair tissues and cells. When we look at fatty acids, there are essential fatty acids. Linoleic is one I wrote in your notes. You do not have to memorize them. But remember, fatty acid, if it's essential, you have to eat it daily. So it's important to make sure you're eating these every day in your diet. Now, when we look at these, there's two special ones I'm sure you've heard of, the omega-6 and the omega-3. We need both. It's important to take in both. But we don't want to be out of balance. We want to have more omega-3s and less omega-6. And the omega-3s have been found to be really helpful for lowering heart risk from heart attacks, helps improve our blood vessels. They also found that it helps with our brain and helps with memory. So traditionally, these are the ones we talk about in fish, tuna, salmon, really good wild-caught salmon. You can see some of the list here. You can also get them from plants. So chia seeds are really high in omega-3s, walnuts, flax seeds, flaxseed oil as well. And so you make sure that as you look at your diets that you're getting enough of those omega-3s. And if we look at this graphic I put in here, it just kind of gives you a visual on things to avoid with your fats and things to eat more of. As far as meat goes, there is a difference in meat and dairy when it comes from the grass-fed cattle versus the grain-fed. So you're seeing the omega-3 levels. Notice the grass-fed have higher omega-3 than the grain-fed. And this has actually also been shown in milk and dairy products from grass-fed cattle as well. So it's something to think about. And the other thing I want to mention is, just really quick, back in the 70s is when they started changing dietary recommendations, and they started saying that if you eat fat, you're going to get fat. So they pushed this whole movement of high carb, low fat diets. And if you look at the changes in Americans with obesity and type 2 diabetes, it has skyrocketed since then. So clearly that's not the answer. And in fact, a lot of research is coming back to having the whole milk dairy products, because when you eat some fat in your meal, it also helps you feel full longer, so it's less likely that you'll overeat. And if you're eating all those high carb foods, a lot of times when you're eating them, you're eating more of the simple carbs and the processed foods, which we know are not good for us. In fact, our liver will take those excess carbs pretty quickly with insulin and convert it into fat. So I would recommend you do your own research before you decide to have what kind of dairy products to buy or what to do, because it definitely seems like it's changing. And in fact, eating fat doesn't necessarily make you fat. It's just when you overeat, whether it's any nutrient. And so a lot of that mindset has been changing. When we look at the lipids, we have the lipoproteins, and we've talked about that chylomicron and the chylomicron remnant. There's 5 categories of lipoproteins, and lipoprotein means lipid, which is shown in yellow in these images, and then the protein. And when we're looking at this, the density tells you the amount of protein. So notice HDL has very little yellow, has very little fat, and more of these proteins on it. Whereas if we look at the chylomicron, that's the fattiest one. That has the most fat, least protein. So they're named in the order of the lipid and the protein. So very low density, VLDL, has less fat than the chylomicron, but more fat than HDL. LDL is low density. Well, it's low density because it has less fat, notice, than very low density. There is an IDL. We don't usually talk about this one too much. We'll focus more on these three. When we look at lipids, the chylomicron was what was absorbed in the small intestine. It travels in your lymph until it gets to the thoracic duct, or if it's from the right side of the body, the right lymphatic duct, and then it enters into the subclavian vein. Once it's in your blood, that chylomicron gets split. The triglyceride gets broken off of it, and then that's going to go to be used for energy, as we talked about. Well, when you take the triglyceride off, we just call the rest of it the chylomicron remnant. That's what's left over. That's all the lipid from your meal. So it's the rest of the cholesterol and phospholipids and fat-soluble vitamins, and that goes to the liver for processing. So when the chylomicron remnant goes to the liver is going to process it, and it basically converts it into VLDL. So VLDL still has a lot of lipid on it. VLDL is going to leave the liver and go into your bloodstream. And when it goes into your bloodstream, it typically heads over to your triglycerides, it heads over to your adipose tissue, and it drops off fat here so it can be stored with the triglyceride. So VLDL's main job is to take cholesterol and take fat to adipose tissue for storage. When it drops it off, now it doesn't have as much fat. VLDL, pretty fatty. When you get rid of fat, now you become LDL. So then it simply leaves as LDL, and it continues throughout your body system as it circulates. The problem with the LDL is it often deposits excess lipids in your blood vessels. And so as those blood vessels have some sort of inflammation or damage, that was the first step, the LDL sticks to it. And as it sticks to it, it starts to form this plaque, this atherosclerosis in your blood vessels. So that's why LDL is the bad cholesterol, because it's supposed to take cholesterol to the rest of the cells of your body. The cells in your body have little receptors for LDL. So when LDL binds to the receptor, the cells take it up and they use it for all their cell membranes. Any excess LDL is what spills over into the blood vessels and can cause problems. So VLDL, basically one loop, takes the lipids to the fat cells for storage. Then we're skipping IDL. It becomes LDL. And then LDL's job is to drop off cholesterol at all cells of the body. They have a receptor, and any excess LDL is unfortunately going to be stuck inside your blood vessels. Now, HDL, I call this the roto-rooter, because HDL comes through and it picks up all the extra fat from your blood vessels and takes it back to your liver. So HDL is the good cholesterol because it's always cleaning out your blood vessels. This is the picture from your book, and you see the VLDL coming out to the adipocytes and dropping off fats, any of the fats, triglycerides, cholesterol, etc., because the adipocytes will hold on to those. Then it leaves as LDL. LDL binds to receptors, and it's trying to drop off fat to your cells because your cells need the lipid. But any excess is going to come out and be deposited in your blood vessels. Whereas if we look at HDL, it leaves empty, and as it travels through circulation, it picks up lipid and brings it back to the liver, and the liver gets rid of all that excess lipid and cholesterol through bile. So HDL is the good cholesterol, LDL is the bad. And when you're looking at the numbers, you don't have to memorize these specific numbers, but if you look at this chart, you should have a rough idea of where the desirable levels are. So you really want your total cholesterol to be less than 200. And total cholesterol, by the way, is just you have to have your HDL, your LDL, and then they take your triglycerides and divide the triglycerides by 5. That's why your notes say 20% of triglycerides, the same thing as dividing by 5. Notice your LDL, you want that lower. HDL, you want higher. It runs around 50, so the higher the HDL, the better. The lower the LDL, the better. And then triglycerides are important as well because these are the circulating lipids in the body. So things that can cause it are definitely genetics. Can't pick your parents, so we definitely know there's a genetic link. If you have especially type 2 diabetes or obesity, you increase your risk of having high cholesterol. We know diet affects it. The trans fats are the biggest issue. Trans fats can really increase your LDL. We know smoking, never good. Smoking lowers your HDL. And being physically inactive. In fact, they found that if you're sedentary, your effects or your risk of heart disease from being sedentary are the same as if you smoke. So it's very, very important to be active. And again, you don't have to be running, and just go out and walk or just park further away from class. And then we know age affects it, especially in postmenopausal women, because when women lose estrogen actually increases our HDL and decreases our LDL. And so if you go through menopause and your estrogen drops, then now you decrease HDL and your LDL goes up. And depending if you're on birth control, that can also affect your cholesterol as well. So, what do you do if you're having high cholesterol? Well, we're not memorizing the table. There's a bunch of different meds. So a lot of times they first go after the drug treatment. They like to give you these statins. And so statins are a group of drugs. They actually target an enzyme in the liver that's the liver uses to make cholesterol. So if they block this enzyme, then the liver cannot make cholesterol. So it helps lower that. And so they are first line. They do affect skeletal muscle. They can cause a lot of muscle pain as well. They also have drugs that don't allow you to absorb cholesterol. So again, that would be helpful. But if you don't absorb it, it comes out the other end. So you could have some cramps and slippery, slidey, fatty stools. We know that niacin helps. A lot of times people take a large intake of niacin. It can have some side effects to it. And then there's some other meds or combo treatments. So most drugs target the liver to try to prevent the liver from making cholesterol. Some drugs try to block your small intestine from absorbing it. And I don't know if they know exactly the mechanism, but niacin seems to also decrease producing the LDL. But what if you don't want to go on meds? Well, there are things you can do. We know that you want to eat more fiber, especially soluble, sticky fiber, whole grains, fruits. There's some evidence that having garlic and green tea might help with your cholesterol levels. And then avoid the high fructose corn syrup because that can cause more lipids to form in your liver. As far as the fats go, as I mentioned a minute ago, we really want to get more of those omega-3s, especially our fish oils. They really help lower cholesterol and raise HDL. You can see your monounsaturated and your polyunsaturated are best. We avoid the trans as much as possible. In fact, they've pretty much been banned in most fast food restaurants, but they're in a lot of foods that we eat, so you should keep an eye on that. We also know we can do some lifestyle things. So we can stop smoking, exercise, right? Keep your weight low. Coming back for 1 second, I did see in your notes I added the grass-fed beef. Again, I mentioned that previously, but a lot of times anything we can do to increase our omega-3s would be helpful. When we're looking at lifestyle, there are things we can do to really help with our cholesterol. It usually takes about 3 months, if you start exercising and lose weight and quit smoking to start to see changes. And again, lifestyle, technically diet, right, is easy to change or somewhat easy to change if you think about that as a lifestyle factor as well. When we look at protein comes from animal products and plants. Now, animal products are complete proteins, and what that means is they contain all essential amino acids. A plant product does have protein, but they're not complete. Now, there's new, pastas and grains that they're supplemented to have all of the amino acids. So just check the label if you're vegan or you're not eating a lot of animal protein, just to make sure you're getting it. Because if you're missing an amino acid and trying to make a protein, you won't make it. So if you're lifting weights and you're trying to make more myosin, and if you're missing the amino acids for it, you won't make it. And then that ATP, that amino acid, it's just used to make ATP, or your body typically converts it into fat, remember, and stores it that way. Just showing you some of the essential amino acids. We do not need to memorize all of them, but you can see the types of foods that are considered complete proteins and why. And we know we need protein for many reasons. We know that there's a structural component to it. So we have our collagen, elastin. We know that they're important for transport. Notice the hemoglobin. We know we have our muscle proteins, protection, hormones. Proteins are critical, which is why we want to use them to build things and not to break anything down. We'd want to take them in and use them. We don't want to burn them for ATP. So, if you're looking at, well, how much do you need? Because if you eat too much, you're just going to convert it as glycogen or fat. So do you need protein powder? I don't know. It depends on what you eat. So you can see some common foods and how much protein is in it. And if you're trying to figure out, well, how much protein do I need to eat a day? You take your body weight. And if you know your body weight in pounds, all you do is divide that by 2.2 and you get your body weight in kilograms. And then if you're sedentary or if you're exercising, so a lot of times they'll usually say maybe multiply it by like 1 to 1.2, so you know how many grams of protein you should get a day. And you should track it and just see, are you getting enough protein? The nitrogen balance is one way of estimating or measuring your protein, because whenever we take in protein, remember that amino group gets converted into ammonia, and then ammonia gets converted to urea, and we need to eliminate that. Our kidneys get rid of urea in our urine. And so we have to process this ammonia. So if you collected your urine for 24 hours, you can kind of get a sense if you're in nitrogen balance. You're in balance if the nitrogen that comes in is equal to what's excreted. Now, if you have higher nitrogen coming in than you're excreting, then you're building. This is actually not bad. This is good if you're pregnant, if you're a child. You want to be in a positive nitrogen balance, meaning that you have more protein being made than broken down. If, however, you're excreting nitrogen faster than you're taking it in, now you're wasting away. So this could happen in a fast, or diseases or injuries or wound states. So especially if you are healing or you are sick, really watch your protein intake so that you can heal and recover faster, because proteins form the structural support for most tissues in our bodies. As far as the micros go, just know that we have vitamins. You don't burn them for ATP. A lot of times they're coenzymes, so they're necessary for our enzymes to work. And we have what are called lipid soluble and water soluble vitamins. So water soluble vitamins will never be toxic because you pee them out. They're just excreted in the urine. And when we look at the water soluble, we have our B vitamins. Generally, think of the B vitamins for metabolism. They're critical for those metabolic pathways. B12, remember, was necessary for making red blood cells. When we look at vitamin C is really important in producing collagen, which is one of the main proteins in all of our tissues. And if you look at your B vitamins, you can see a lot of our grains and cereals are like fortified with extra B vitamins, but mostly function for metabolism. Vitamin C is in your citrus fruits, anything orange and red. And so it's an antioxidant, so it protects us. There's things called free radicals, which are produced from metabolism, and they damage cells. So it helps protect, and these free radicals can cause cancer. So it also helps with our immune system, and it's critical for collagen. Our fat soluble can be toxic because we store these. So vitamin A is in your similar with beta carotene, so a lot of yellow vegetables, leafy greens. Vitamin A is necessary to see at night. This is the one that's necessary for the rods. It really helps your skin and your epithelial tissue grow, so it's in a lot of skin creams. It helps with bone growth, and it seems to be protective against cancer and heart disease. Vitamin D has a lot of functions right now, and everybody I've ever spoken to who had vitamin D levels tested was deficient, just for where we live. If you get 20 minutes of sunlight a day, you make it, but you may want to get your vitamin D levels checked and consider supplementing with vitamin D. We know we need it to absorb calcium, but it also helps with the immune system and seems to be anti-inflammatory. And there's a lot of other studies that are looking at vitamin D, so definitely get it checked out. Vitamin E is in a lot of our oils and nuts. It's a really important antioxidant, and so it also helps with our immune system. And vitamin K, think K for coagulation. This is what your liver needs to make your clotting factors. But remember that the intestinal bacteria in your large intestine, which, by the way, a lot of it is just E. coli. I'm not sure if you knew that. You know, we hear about E. coli as the bad guy, but inside us, it's one of the main bacteria that makes these vitamins for us. And when you look at the minerals, just know we have sodium, chloride, potassium. We'll talk more about these when we do fluid and electrolyte balance, but we know we need calcium for our nerve impulses, for muscle contraction and blood clotting. As far as chloride, just know it's important it basically follows sodium wherever it goes. So it helps. We talked about the chloride shift for transporting CO2. We know sodium's critical for every physiological process. Any excitable cell needs sodium to enter to conduct a nerve impulse or for a muscle to contract. And we also know potassium is also important with sodium for all those excitable cells. Magnesium's interesting. It's a cofactor, and it does help with protein synthesis and bone formation. And it's also it helps relax muscle. It helps relax smooth muscle. And so often adding magnesium might be helpful if you're trying to have heart health, or my son gets migraines, and so they recommended magnesium. We did it for the seizures and it helped, and we continue to do it with the migraines because it helps decrease their occurrence. As far as the trace ones go, the ones I would expect you to know would be iron. We know iron's necessary to transport oxygen. It binds to the iron on the hemoglobin. Copper was part of the electron transport chain we looked at for metabolism, and it's also helps you form hemoglobin. And then zinc has a lot of functions, but zinc often does help with our immune system, so it does seem to boost immunity as well. And then last is water. We know we have to have water. It's the most important inorganic compound. You're supposed to drink, if you take your body weight in pounds and divide by 2, that's how many ounces of water you're supposed to have a day. So, lots of water and what we eat as well. We know it helps maintain body temperature because water can store heat. We know it's a solvent. Things dissolve in water because it's polar. So urine is 95% water, plasma 90% water. So it's really good at transporting things. It's a part of every chemical reaction. When we do dehydration synthesis, remember we remove water to build things. So if we take an amino acid and an amino acid and we combine it and we're trying to build a protein, that's through dehydration synthesis. We pull water out. Whereas hydrolysis, we add water to break chemical bonds. And then it's really important for cushioning and lubrication. It's in synovial fluid. It's in cerebrospinal fluid. It's in all those serous fluids we studied, like pericardial fluid, peritoneal fluid. And so it's a very important lubricant for us. So this wraps up our lecture on nutrition.